Hey everyone, welcome back. All right, so get this. It's March 2020. This camper, a guy named Andrew, is way out in the Victorian high country exploring one of the most remote, beautiful, and honestly kind of creepy places in Australia, the Wanangara Valley. He's at this spot called Bucks Camp and he stumbles onto a scene that just feels totally off. He sees this white Toyota Land Cruiser and the car looks pretty new, and right next to it, the campsite also looks really odd. Andrew is super weirded out, so he checks out an esky cooler he finds nearby, and the food inside is still fresh. So he yells out trying to find out who owns the camp, but gets nothing back but silence. He takes a few photos of the camp on his phone and just gets the hell out of there because he's very unsettled by it. Then a few days later, another camper named Nicholas Linden finds the same scene. He calls it alarming, something you just don't see every day, and he's so freaked out that he actually calls the cops. Now, the Wanangara Valley isn't just some random spot in the bush. It's got this dark, bloody history. It's famous for one of Australia's biggest unsolved mysteries, the Wanangara murders of 1918. And back then, two guys, a station manager and his cook, just vanished from the valley. Their bodies turned up months apart. Both were murdered and the killer was never found. So for over 100 years, the valley has just kept that secret. And now it looked like it was happening all over again. A ghost campsite, its owner's gone without a trace, and this beautiful, remote, lonely valley that just seems to swallow people whole. Hi everyone, welcome back. And to anyone new watching, hello, my name is Sarah, and on this channel, we dive into true crime cases. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please join the fam, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it around. Taking 2 seconds to really do that really helps me out, helps the channel out, and it just means so much to me, you guys. You have no idea. So to everyone that always supports, thank you so much. Also, if you want to get to know each other a little bit more, consider becoming a channel member. You get instant access to our private Discord server and we can chat one-on-one about anything and everything. I've made a lot of friends on there, so you can just hit the join button right now below the video to get in. And okay, now let's get into this wild case that happened in the peak of COVID. So you would think that the most interesting part of this case is the Wanangara Valley, but it actually is the two people who owned that ghost campsite. They weren't just any campers. They were carrying this huge secret that had been part of their lives for over a decade. So first you've got Russell Hill. He was 74 years old and a total man of the bush. He was a retired logging contractor from a town called Druin and had basically spent his whole life working out in the Victorian wilderness. His job was a process of dragging logs out of the bush after they had been cut down. So for him, camping wasn't just like a fun weekend thing. It was like going home. It was his peace, his alone time. He knew the Wanangara Valley like the back of his hand. In fact, years ago, he'd actually helped build one of the main 4x4 tracks in the areas, a road called the Zika Spur Track. His mates used to say that if you wanted to know anything about the valley, any secret track or hidden spot, Russell was your guy. He was also a huge amateur radio guy, and every single night at 6 p.m., like clockwork, he'd hop on his radio and chat with his friends no matter where he was. And lately, he'd gotten into a new hobby, flying drones. People had different ideas about what he was like. His friends said that he was happy, he was this friendly dude who loved a good chat and was happy as a pig in shit when he was camping. But a park worker who saw him on his most recent camping trip had a totally different vibe of him, saying he was this grumpy old bugger who seemed like he was on a mission. This whole two sides of the coin thing with Russell's personality would become a pretty big deal later on. Russell met a woman named Robin in 1968, and a year later they got married, and initially they lived in Lilydale before moving to a flat in Nayuk, east of Melbourne. They were both in their 20s and built a nice life together. In 1970, their first daughter, Deborah, was born, followed by Colleen in 1973 and Jenny in 1977. Russell loved camping, alone, with others, it didn't matter. He would sometimes take his wife Robin with him, and in the past, he would often take his kids camping while they were growing up. By 2020, the couple, now in their 70s, had been living in Druin, a town in the West Gippsland region, 90 kilometers east of Melbourne. Then there was Carol Clay. She was 73 years old, a mum, a grandma, and just a super respected lady in her community. She was a big deal, having been the state president of the Country Women's Association, so the CWA, which is one of the biggest women's groups in Victoria. She spent her life advocating for women's rights in the community, supported communities affected by drought throughout Australia. She supported medical research and dealt with the issues of communities living in social isolation. She was just one of those women who really wanted to help others. Carol had a couple marriages under her belt, and from them she had her daughter Emma. Emma said her mom was a phenomenal woman with this amazing laugh who spent her life fighting for women's rights and was just completely devoted to others. And you can really see that through her life's work. She was a great mom and grandma, and despite her pretty prestigious role in an association often stereotyped by, I guess, traditional domestic skills, you would expect Carol to be kind of like very proper, but she actively pursued camping in the remote bushes of the high country. She actually reveled in the freedom of the outdoors, stating that she loved the country girl side of things and did not feel like she had to stick to conventional expectations, like she didn't need to put on her lippy or anything else while camping. She could be mentally, physically, and emotionally free. She was comfortable roughing it in a bush camp in her 70s. So I would say that shows this pretty powerful, resilient personality. So we have these two elderly people who lived full lives and loved the freedom of camping. So how do these two people's lives connect? Well, that brings us to their big secret. So Russell liked camping and Carol liked camping. But what many didn't know was that the two of them liked camping together. So that was how they got their alone time. Alone time for what, you might ask? Because the both of them were married, right? Well, yeah. But that's why it's called an affair, guys. See, Russell and Carol were childhood sweethearts. They dated as teenagers, but you know how it goes. They drifted apart, life happened, and they both ended up marrying other people. Russell was actually Carol's first boyfriend, her first love. But then, decades later, in their 60s, they found each other again and totally rekindled that old romance. So for the next 15 years, they were having a secret affair that kind of was not so secret at times. The big problem was it seemed that they were trying to make their relationship somewhat exclusive at one point, or so it seemed that one person thought so, that person being Carol, because while Carol had split from her second husband, I believe his name was Linton, in the belief of being exclusive with Russell, Russell was still married to his wife of over 50 years, Robin. The affair was this secret he kept locked down from his family. Now, here's where it gets kind of diabolical to me. So, Robin had actually met Carol soon after she married Russell, and Russell introduced Carol to his wife as his cousin. So, Robin knew Carol as essentially a family member. It was her husband's cousin. I doubt she would have thought much of it. And it seems like for decades, they never really had much contact. You know, Russell never really talked to his cousin. But in the early 2000s, when Russell and Carol met again and began their affair, Russell and Carol were honestly pretty brazen about their affair. Russell and Robin, together with Carol and her husband at the time, Linton, would all go to Carol and Linton's holiday home in Phillip Island for a vacation. So they had done this a couple times, and then on one of these vacations, Russell and Carol went on a long walk together alone. Robin did find this really strange, but then again, it's his cousin. Maybe they're bonding over family stuff. So also, Russell was Robin's first boyfriend and first love. She didn't have any real reason in the past to doubt her husband. He was a good man and father to their kids, you know? At one point back in 2006, I believe this was around the time or a couple years into their affair, Russell's neighbor Jill found out about Carol and basically gave Russell an ultimatum. Either you tell your wife or I will. So Russell came clean to Robin. And this was the first time Robin learned that Carol was in fact not related to them. Russell sat Robin down and promised her and their daughters that he'd end the affair. And they believed him, but he was lying. Due to their affair now having to be for reals on the down low, their camping trips were their only getaway. It was the only place they could really be together away from prying eyes. Russell's Land Cruiser was all kitted out for camping and even had a special spot just for Carol's stuff. Which, you know, as I was researching this case, okay, it's pretty heartbreaking as a wife. Like, the media really focuses on the affair, and I feel like this probably broke Robin's heart. On March 19th, 2020, right as COVID was becoming what it became, Russell left for his camping trip to the Wanangata Valley. His wife, Robin, even helped him pack the car with no idea he wasn't going alone. She thought he was going camping by himself. For Carol's friends and family, their relationship was kind of like an open secret. They knew she was happy and they said she liked the situation and wasn't fussed that Russell was still married to Robin. Robin had bought her husband a fresh box of antidepressants along with cans of bourbon and Coke and a bottle of Bundaberg rum for his final trip away. She also gave him $20 to $30 in cash for his lunch that day, so, he didn't have to use his credit card. She was just this loving, sweet wife. Now, Robin later claimed Russell had been dealing with depression for a while, and that's why he had been taking these antidepressants on and off for over a decade. She said it stemmed from one camping trip where he had to be hospitalized because his penis was extremely enlarged and wouldn't go down, and that's what the depression stemmed from, which sounds really odd because it seems like he may have taken a little blue pill and that seems like a side effect from that pill. But what do I know? That's just what was reported in the news. So on March 18th, Russell heads off. And I think I said March 19th before, but it was actually March 18th. Russell, he headed off in his white Land Cruiser, said goodbye to his wife. He's about to go camping to the Wanangata Valley for some peace and quiet. But he makes a 30-minute detour to Pakenham to pick up his girl, Carol. They together make the 4-hour drive to their camping site called Bucks Camp and set up their tent. Their porta potty and Russell's Land Cruiser had this really neat setup where all their camping gear was accessible from the side of the car. The following night at 6 p.m., Russell hops on his radio and chats with his mates. Robin listened for his voice on the radio as she usually did, and this was the first time she had actually heard from him since he left, because the night before he arrived, he told her it would be too late to hop onto the radio, so she didn't hear from him the night that he actually arrived at camp. So when she heard his voice the following night, she was like, oh, okay, he's all good. He arrived safely, like he's all good. But that was it. That was the last time Robin heard her husband's voice on the radio. By 25th March, after days of not hearing from him, Robin called the police and went to the Warragul police station to report him missing. What happened to Russell? His family believed he was only doing what he usually did, going camping, something he loved doing. For Russell's family, the truth would come out in the worst way possible during the massive police investigation into his disappearance. This secret double life ended up being a huge deal because when he first went missing, it caused a massive delay. Russell's family thought he was alone, but Carol's family knew she was going camping with Russell. They were aware of their affair. So because of this, Carol's family didn't want to call the cops right away when she didn't return home because they knew a missing persons report would just blow this affair wide open. Those lost days were crucial in the case. So the police show up at Russell and Carol's campsite, this same campsite that other campers, Andrew and Nicholas, had stumbled upon, this ghost campsite. Strangely enough, Andrew came upon the campsite on March 21st, only a few days after Russell and Carol arrived. And then on March 25th, another camper named Nicholas saw this abandoned campsite, and it was enough to make him call the cops. And he actually reported this abandoned campsite right before Robin reported Russell missing. So it was all happening around the same time. What was so shocking about this abandoned campsite? Well, for one, it was completely burned to the ground. The entire tent, the car battery was destroyed, gas cylinders, a cooking stove, a solar panel, an iPad, they were all just burned. The esky was full with cans of Coke, beer, alcohol, and milk. The side of the Land Cruiser was also charred, but it was charred on the outside, like the inside was still intact. And strangely, the porta potty was left completely untouched. Inside the car, they found a handbag on the passenger seat. It was open, and wallets were in each of the car footwells with all the cash gone. There were no obvious signs of a fight, no blood, nothing to give them a solid lead. These wallets, however, showed this campsite belonged to Russell and Carol, but they were nowhere to be found. Their phones were also missing, and Russell's drone was also missing. Theories began to run wild. Were they lost somewhere in the bush? They're two elderly people. Did they have an accident? Did they run off together? This valley was known to have a dark past. Were they now its newest victims? Reports of two people acting strangely in the area came forward, especially by someone known to the locals as Button Man. He seemed to be a recluse who was often in the bush and spooked visitors, but these were quickly ruled out. Russell and Carol's banks were checked for any activity, and they contacted family members to see if anyone had heard from them, but nothing. until they pinged their phones. Both Russell and Carol's phones pinged in the Alpine region around lunchtime on March 19th, but had gone offline as they drove deeper into the Wanagata Valley. For 20 months, the disappearance of Russell Hill and Carol Clay was a total mystery. For months, the case was completely cold, and the families of Russell and Carol were just stuck in this horrible limbo with no answers and no one to blame. And I remember on the news, like, COVID was rampant, but then the news about these missing campers was also like everywhere. It was crazy. The big break in the case came from the most random place. A little automatic number plate recognition camera near Mount Hotham, the kind they use to catch people trying to dodge the entry fees for the ski resorts. That camera had snapped a picture of a dark blue Nissan Patrol leaving the high country on the morning of March 21st. On its own, that didn't mean much, but then Russell's phone data showed something insane. At that exact time the Nissan Patrol was photographed, Russell's phone pinged a nearby cell tower. The phone was moving in the same direction at the same speed as that car. It was the holy crap moment the investigators needed. For the first time, they had a direct link between a car and the missing couple. So the cops traced the registration of that Nissan Patrol to a 55-year-old Jetstar pilot from a Melbourne suburb called Caroline Springs. His name was Gregory Stewart Lynn. When detectives started watching his house, they noticed something that made all the alarm bells go off. The Nissan Patrol in his driveway wasn't dark blue anymore. He'd repainted it a totally different color, a sandy beige. From that moment, Greg Lynn was their guy. The police went all in with a covert operation. They put listening devices in Greg's house and his car, and they put hidden cameras up, hoping he'd say something stupid. Greg lived with his wife and was an outdoorsman who enjoyed pig hunting and camping too. At home, he kept an arsenal of hunting knives, daggers, and guns, and he was currently working as a pilot, but had worked many jobs in the past, including an asparagus picker and a river guide. A couple months after the disappearance in July 2020, police did approach Greg at his home. They told him they were investigating the disappearance of Russell and Carol and were looking for any witnesses that were present in the valley at the same time. So Greg said, yeah, he was present at the campsite during that time and he was willing to help, telling them about his movements on that trip. It was when the police were leaving his home that they realized that his blue car was now beige. On November 13th, 2021, the TV show 60 Minutes did a special on the case, and they showed the public the footage of the mysterious blue Nissan Patrol asking for help. Greg and his wife were watching that show from their couch, and his wife even turned to him and said, "Oh my God, Greg, that really looks like your car and trailer." And then just a few days later, on November 19th, hidden CCTV cameras planted by the police caught him taking the distinctive black awning off the side of his car. You can see him holding the awning on his shoulder and getting rid of it. On November 22nd, 2021, 20 months after Russell and Carol disappeared, the cops made their move. In this super dramatic operation, heavily armed special ops officers swooped in on a remote campsite in a place called Arbuckle, not far from the Wanagata Valley, and arrested Greg. Over a few days of interviews, Greg calmly told the detectives his whole tragic accident story. So the story of what actually happened on that last night in the valley, it's a story with only one side, really, one narrator, and surprise, surprise, he's the guy who killed them. The timeline of their last few days is a mix of solid facts and one man's very convenient, very self-serving story. So it all kicked off on March 18th, 2020, the day before Russell and Carol arrived at the campsite. So this 55-year-old guy, this airline pilot, Greg, he was this guy who was an experienced hunter and outdoorsman, and he drove his dark blue Nissan Patrol deep into the Wanagata Valley and set up camp at Bucks Camp. He was there by himself and he was just planning to do some deer hunting. The next day, March 19th, is when Russell and Carol arrived, setting up their own camp not too far from where Greg was already set up. So on Friday, March 20th, the day started out pretty normal, and Greg later told the cops that his first chats with the couple were pretty friendly, no big deal. He went off into the bush to hunt for deer. According to him, his hunt was going fine until he got annoyed by this really loud buzzing sound like a swarm of bees. So he looks up and he sees a drone hovering over him. When he gets back to the campsite later, he sees Russell with the drone and realizes, oh, this drone belongs to this guy. And this is where the facts stop and now Greg's story takes over and we don't really know the truth. According to him, this is what happened next. Russell came over and confronted him, pissed off that he'd been hunting too close to the campsite. He told Greg that he had footage of him on his drone and was going to take it to the cops. Greg said he thought Russell was being a bit of a clown and went back to his own campsite and just ignored him. But to get back at him, he decided to be a bit of a jerk and start blasting loud music from his car stereo just to annoy the old guy. He claimed that Russell and Carol were in their tent, insinuating they may have been trying to be intimate that night. So to annoy Russell, he wanted to disrupt them by playing this music really loudly. So later that night, sometime between 9 and 10 p.m., Greg claimed he heard a noise and saw Russell walking away from his car, his Nissan Patrol. And what was Russell holding? Greg's own 12-gauge shotgun and a magazine of ammo. He said Russell then fired one, maybe two, warning shots up into the air and yelled, "Fuck off," terrified that the next shot was going to be at him. Greg said he hid behind Russell's Toyota before deciding he had to try and get his gun back. He described this desperate struggle. The two men are wrestling over the shotgun right next to the bull bar of Russell's car. He told Russell to let go of the gun, but he wouldn't. He said his eyes were locked on Russell's and his hands weren't on the trigger, but Russell's must have been, because right then the gun went off. The blast ripped through the side mirror of the Toyota and the shot hit Carol, who was standing nearby, right in the head. She died instantly. Greg claimed that in the shock of it all, Russell dropped the gun. Greg then grabbed his gun, fired the remaining rounds into the air so that it was empty, and then walked off. Russell apparently went nuts, screaming, "She's dead," before coming at him with a black-handled kitchen knife. They struggled for a second time, and this chaotic fight then ended with the both of them on the ground. When Greg got up, he said the knife was stuck in Russell's chest. He said Russell crawled a little bit, then stopped, rolled over, and died. In just a few minutes, both Russell and Carol were dead. The last solid piece of information we have from that day was at 6 p.m. when Russell made his nightly radio call to his friends. He sounded totally normal, no hint of any trouble. After that, just silence. And this man's story, Greg's story of this double tragedy, so unbelievable, really. He said it was like being struck by lightning twice. But then Greg confessed to the cover-up. He admitted that he panicked after they died, terrified that he'd be blamed and that his whole life would be over, his pilot career, his family, even his memberships to fancy sporting clubs, because, that's what's important. So he laid out what he did in chilling detail. He described loading the bodies of Russell and Carol into his trailer. He cleaned up any blood at the scene and then set their campfire and his clothes on fire to destroy all the evidence. He then drove through the night looking for somewhere to dump their bodies and eventually dumped their bodies on the side of a remote track called Union Spur. But his cover-up didn't stop there. He told police he was so paranoid about the bodies being found that he went back to the spot in May 2020 just to check on them. He sold the trailer he used to transport the bodies, he cleaned his guns, and then repainted his Nissan. Then in November 2020, 8 months after he killed them, he went back one last time. This time he brought kerosene. He spent the night burning their remains until there was, as the judge later said, almost nothingness, just fragments left. Following his directions on November 30th, 2021, police went to the Union Spur track and found what was left of Russell and Carol. The mystery of where they were was finally over, but the question of what really happened that night was just getting started. The trial of Greg Lynn kicked off on May 14th, 2024, and it was basically a showdown between two completely different stories. The prosecution, led by a guy named Daniel Porcedu, argued that this was straight up cold-blooded murder. They admitted they didn't have a clear motive, but they figured it was probably some dumb argument over Russell's drone or Greg's hunting that just blew up. But their case wasn't really about motive, it was about what Greg did after they died. Daniel told the jury that Greg's extreme and extraordinary decision to not just hide the bodies, but to come back months later and burn them to ash was way over the top for what he claimed was an accidental killing. These weren't the actions of a guy who just panicked. They were the actions of a murderer, carefully getting rid of every last shred of evidence that could prove what he did. The prosecution's theory was that Greg killed Russell first, and then he murdered Carol just because she saw it happen. It also brought up Greg's past. His first wife, Lisa, was found dead outside her home in 1999 following an overdose. The toxicology report showed a blood alcohol level of 0.21, which is over 4 times the driving limit, as well as high levels of an antidepressant medication. Their kids were asleep in bed, only 3 and 1 years old at the time, and family photos were found scattered on the living room floor. But Lisa's parents said she was in this extremely abusive relationship with Greg, where he would often threaten to kill her, and that even if he didn't actually kill her, the abuse he put her through certainly caused her death. Although the coroner couldn't identify any suspicious circumstances surrounding Lisa's death, it definitely shed a bad light on Greg during this case. Other parts of Greg's past were called into question, including him killing animals, I believe beheading a pet, refusing to feed his kids when he was supposed to be caring for them, exploding into fits of rage in public places, and getting into various altercations with many strangers. None of this was obviously shared with the jury, but the media was talking. The defense, led by Dermot Dan, painted a totally different picture. They argued that the deaths were just a tragic accident, and they admitted that what Greg did after was horrible, but they claimed he just made a series of terrible choices because he was in a panic state, convinced that he'd be blamed for something he didn't do. Greg himself even got on the stand, the one and only witness for the defense, and he looked right at the jury and apologized to the families for all the pain his cover-up caused. But he was dead set on his innocence, saying flat out, "I haven't killed anyone." The whole trial really boiled down to a couple key pieces of evidence. So first, there was the murder weapon, Greg's 12-gauge shotgun. A ballistics expert from the Victoria Police testified that he tested the gun like crazy and he found that it worked perfectly. And its trigger was actually a bit heavier than normal. So that means that you'd have to pull the trigger much harder than usual to make it fire, which makes it pretty unlikely it would just go off by accident during a struggle, because in the struggle, you're both trying to get the gun, and Russell having his finger on the trigger perfectly to push it down hard enough, it just seemed unlikely. But the prosecution's biggest bombshell was something tiny, found almost 2 years later after the crime. So in May 2022, police did one last search of the original campsite at Bucks Camp, and they found this small mangled piece of lead, no bigger than like chewing gum, and it was logged into evidence as item 55. Forensic testing revealed two things. It had been fired from Greg's shotgun, and it was covered in Carol's DNA. So this was the smoking gun. This tiny piece of metal was the undeniable proof that linked Greg's gun directly to Carol's death. But something that confused me, and I don't know, maybe one of you guys can help me out. I couldn't find the exact information on this. But okay, so they found that, with Carol's DNA on it, with the bullet being from Greg's gun. But how does that disprove his theory that he didn't fire the shot, that it was Russell that fired it? So I guess together with the fact that the trigger was hard to pull, that it couldn't have been an accidental thing, I still don't get how they're like, yeah, that's the piece. I guess it's just the fact that it links the two of them together, but it doesn't actually, to me at least, prove that Russell was the one that fired the gun. It just proves that the gun killed Carol. Do you know what I mean? On June 25th, 2024, after chewing on it for nearly 7 days, the jury came back with a verdict that nobody saw coming. It was a split decision. For the murder of Russell Hill, the verdict was not guilty. For the murder of Carol Clay, the verdict was guilty. You could literally hear a gasp in the courtroom. The verdict was a direct result of Greg's own actions. For Carol, the jury had item 55, the physical proof that she was shot by his gun. His story of a random accidental ricochet just didn't hold up against hard evidence that I guess the ballistics expert thought it was unlikely for an accidental shot to fire. But for Russell, there was nothing. Greg claimed he died in a fight over a knife, and because he had burned the body, the prosecution had no way to prove him wrong. There were no knife wounds to look at, no signs of being hit, nothing. By destroying Russell's body, Greg had destroyed the very evidence they needed to convict him of that murder. It was this horrible legal twist. His monstrous cover-up is what got him off for one of the murders. So that really, pissed off people, because they were like, if he didn't do that, we could have figured out what really happened. On October 18th, 2024, Greg Lynn was sentenced. The judge, Michael Croucher, was actually fighting back tears at times, and he called the murder and cover-up brutal and horrific, and he sentenced Greg to a maximum of 32 years in prison, and he has to serve at least 24 before he can even think about parole. Greg will be 79 years old before he's even eligible for release, and in a letter he later read to the court, Greg still said he was innocent, saying he was disappointed and perplexed by the verdict, but he did apologize for his selfish and callous actions after they died, for his cover-up. His lawyers immediately said they were going to appeal the conviction. So in the end, this case just leaves you with more questions than answers, and this feeling that justice kind of wasn't fully served. The final words really have to go to the families who have had to live through this absolute nightmare, especially during a time like COVID. They probably wanted Greg to be convicted of Russell's murder too, since all of this was based purely on his word, and he was the only one who disposed of and burned the bodies and the evidence. If it really did happen the way he said, the ballistics and the forensics could have proven this somewhat if he called the police immediately, instead of trying to cover it up. After the verdict, the Hill and Clay families put out a joint statement, and they said that they were both relieved and devastated. Relieved that Greg was found guilty of murdering Carol, but they said the not guilty verdict for Russell was just devastating for them. They knew there just wasn't enough evidence left to prove how he died because the guy responsible made sure of it. Carol's daughter, Emma Davies, read a statement in court that was just heartbreaking. She wouldn't even say Greg's name out loud. She told the court, "He stole my mother from me. He took her life. He took her dignity. He burned her beyond all possible recognition." And she said the whole thing just felt like something out of a horror movie. For Russell's family, the pain was just made worse by how absurd the verdict felt. His wife, Robin, had already been through the public humiliation of finding out about her husband's long-term affair during the investigation, and she was just completely baffled by the verdict. She said, "How can you have one person murdered and not the other person who's also dead, and the person that did it is still standing up?" She said she hoped that Greg suffers for the rest of his life and has a lovely time in jail.
I think it makes you feel numb, or his death was for nothing, because no one's going to be punished for it. I did say how I thought the jury did a good idea how they did it, but then it doesn't really... How can you have one person murdered and not the other person who's also dead, and the person that did is still standing up? I hope he suffers for the rest of his life, really. Yeah, I hope he has a lovely time in jail.
The verdict left her and her family in what the judge would later call an excruciating legal limbo, with no real justice for Russell's death. And that's the final haunting thing about this case, because he was acquitted of Russell's murder. The full story of what really happened on that night in the Wanangata Valley will probably never be told. The only person who knows the whole truth is Greg Lynn. And is he telling the truth? Was it a cold-blooded double murder that started over something as stupid as a drone? Was he afraid that Russell would report him doing something illegal to the cops? Or was it, like he claims, a 1 in a billion tragic accident followed by a cover-up by a pure coward? The evidence points one way, but the verdict leaves the question officially unanswered for Russell Hill. Once again, the Wanangata Valley keeps its secrets. I believe Greg's appeal is set for the end of this month, October, so let's see what the outcome of that is. I feel like if this was all some big accident like he claims it was, Greg's actions were just his own undoing. If the bullet ricocheted off the car mirror and hit her, that's actually wild. The car mirror was damaged, so did that really happen? What an unfortunate accident if it did, What I don't get is why Russell would have walked over to Greg's car and taken his gun. First of all, as a gun owner, aren't you supposed to be super cautious with your weapon? So do you just leave it in your car? Also, Russell's family claims Russell himself had inherited guns in the past and he just never really messed with them. So it seems odd to me that Russell would have gone straight for Greg's gun. What for? To steal it from him? It makes no sense unless Russell was a very silly man. I feel like Greg was a bit of a narcissistic man and his ego got in the way and he had very little impulse control. Maybe the argument was just getting out of hand and Russell just didn't give a shit, and maybe it triggered Greg and he pulled out the gun, and then Russell, trying to protect himself, and Carol got into a tussle over the gun. That kind of makes sense, but it doesn't make sense to me that Russell just walks over to his campsite and then just steals the gun. Accidentally shot someone in the head and accidentally stabbed someone to death. I don't know. Doesn't seem sus at all, right? But who knows? Because in Victoria, everyone gets let out on bail to go on and commit more crimes, so don't be surprised if that happens, guys. We need new government. Damn. At the end of the day, this case really focuses on the disgraced pilot who caused 2 deaths and the 2 lovers in a secret affair, and I feel like it needs to focus on how dangerous strangers can be, how when we are I guess, in unfamiliar territory, we need to keep to ourselves, don't engage in nonsense and let our egos get the best of us. It's such a tragic case and so sad for the Hill and Clay families to be put through this because of one man's actions, and it's horrible. Russell and Carol's long lives were overshadowed by this nefarious crime, and although I don't agree with affairs and cheating, it wasn't all they were known for. It wasn't all that they lived for. You know what I mean? They didn't deserve to die because of it. What do you guys think really happened? You know, we'll never know, but sometimes you guys come out with like really good theories. So let me know in the comments down below. Rest in peace to Russell and Carol. So sad. I will see you guys in next week's video and down in the comments. I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. Besitos, guys. Mwah. Bye.